In 1898, something extraordinary happened in an American courtroom that almost nobody talks about today. The Smithsonian Institution, the most trusted name in American science, stood before a judge and was forced to answer a question they had been avoiding for decades. What happened to the giant skeletons? Now, before you click away thinking this is just another internet conspiracy theory, I need you to hear what the newspapers were saying. Not blog posts, not Reddit threads, actual newspapers. The New York Times, the Chicago Tribune, the San Diego Union. Between 1850 and 1930, over 100 mainstream newspapers across America reported the discovery of human skeletons measuring between 7 and 12 feet tall. Let me read you a headline. New York Times, May 11, 1897. Quote, Smithsonian admits to destruction of thousands of giant human skeletons in early 1900s. That is not from some fringe website. That was the paper of record. Here's another one. The San Diego Union, August 5, 1895. The bones of a giant were discovered near San Diego. The article describes a skeleton 9 feet 2 inches tall, found with stone tools and pottery that did not match any known Native American culture. So where are these skeletons now? That is the question that led to the 1898 court case. And here is where it gets interesting. According to court documents that were public record until they mysteriously disappeared from archives in the 1950s, the Smithsonian was accused of taking delivery of these giant remains from excavation sites across America and then making them vanish. The official explanation? They were destroyed to make room for new exhibits. Thousands of skeletons, some of the most remarkable archaeological finds in American history, destroyed for storage space. Does that sound reasonable to you? But wait, it gets stranger. In 1869, there was a famous hoax called the Cardiff Giant. A stone giant was buried in New York and then dug up to fool people. It was exposed as a fake within months. And ever since then, whenever anyone brings up giant skeletons, they get compared to the Cardiff Giant. It is a brilliant strategy when you think about it. Take one proven hoax and use it to discredit hundreds of legitimate finds. Because here is what they do not tell you. The Cardiff Giant was made of gypsum. It was clearly carved. It fooled some people for a few weeks. But the skeletons reported in newspapers were bone. They were examined by local doctors. They were measured. They were photographed in some cases. And then they were shipped to the Smithsonian and never seen again. Let me give you a specific example. In 1833, soldiers digging a pit for a powder magazine in Lompoc Rancho, California, found a skeleton. The local paper reported it was 12 feet tall. It had a double row of teeth. Now, that detail, the double row of teeth, shows up in reports from completely different parts of the country. Wisconsin, Ohio, Nevada. Independent discoveries, same unusual feature. The skeleton was examined by scientists from what would later become Loma Linda University. They confirmed the measurements. They documented the artifacts found with it, including stone weapons of enormous size. The remains were carefully packed and sent to the Smithsonian for further study. And then nothing. No paper published, no exhibit, no follow-up. When researchers inquired years later, they were told no such skeleton existed in the collection. This pattern repeated itself over and over. Mound builders in Ohio would unearth giant bones. Local newspapers would report it. A Smithsonian representative would arrive, take the bones, and that would be the end of the story. By the early 1900s, it had happened so many times that some excavators stopped reporting their finds altogether. Now, I want you to do something for me. Wherever you are watching this right now, drop a comment and tell me what country or state you are from. Because what I am about to show you is not just an American mystery. This is happening on 5 continents. And I want to know how global this audience is, because the evidence is global. In 1911, miners in Lovelock Cave, Nevada, were digging for bat guano to sell as fertilizer. What they found instead were the mummified remains of red-haired giants. The local Paiute tribe had stories about these beings. They called them the Site Ka. According to Paiute oral history, these giants were hostile cannibals who were eventually trapped in the cave and smoked out. The miners found skeletons over 8 feet tall. They found sandals that were 18 inches long. They found the cave exactly where the Paiutes said it would be. Archaeologists from the University of California came to investigate. They confirmed the finds were genuine. They took samples back to Berkeley, and then, once again, silence. The remains disappeared into the university system. When researchers asked to examine them in the 1980s, they were told the bones had been lost. Lost. The most significant find in Nevada archaeological history. Just lost. Here is what bothers me most about this whole thing. We displayed dinosaur bones in every natural history museum in the world. Dinosaurs that died 65 million years ago. We can find them, preserve them, study them, and put them on exhibit for school children. But we cannot seem to hold on to human skeletons from just a few thousand years ago? Skeletons that were documented, measured, photographed, and shipped to our most prestigious institutions? Something does not add up. And before you think this is all ancient history, let me bring you to 2002, Kandahar, Afghanistan. American soldiers on a routine patrol reportedly encountered a giant, not a skeleton, a living giant, over 12 feet tall, with red hair and 6 fingers on each hand. According to multiple military testimonies that leaked online, the creature killed one soldier before being taken down. The body was allegedly airlifted out by helicopter. When researchers filed Freedom of Information Act requests for any documentation of this incident, they were denied. Not because the documents do not exist, but because they are classified for reasons of national security. Why would a skeleton be a matter of national security? Now, let me show you something that will make you question everything you thought you knew about history. I am going to show you newspaper headlines. Real newspapers. From the 1800s and early 1900s. Papers you can still look up in library archives if you know where to search. Wisconsin Decatur Republican, 1897. Giant bones found in mound. Greensburg Daily News, Indiana, 1930. Skeleton of giant found in local excavation. Moberly Monitor Index, Missouri, 1913. Giant skeleton discovered near Moberly. These are not tabloids. These are local papers reporting what their communities were finding. And here is the pattern that should make you suspicious. After 1930, these reports stopped, not because people stopped finding things, but because newspapers stopped reporting them. What changed in the 1930s? The Smithsonian Act was amended. Museums gained more control over archaeological finds. The federal government created guidelines for what could and could not be published about American prehistory. And suddenly, giants disappeared from the newspapers. But they did not disappear from the ground. In 1976, construction workers in Death Valley found a burial site with remains over 9 feet tall. The site was immediately shut down. Anthropologists from a nearby university were denied access. The area was covered over and construction rerouted. That information only came out because one of the workers talked to a local reporter off the record. So let me ask you this. If these are all hoaxes, all mistakes, all misidentified normal skeletons, why the secrecy? Why not let scientists examine the claims and debunk them publicly? Why confiscate remains? Why classify military reports? Why lose university specimens? The answer I am going to give you over the next hour and 20 minutes is going to challenge everything you were taught in school. Because the evidence is not hidden in some dark conspiracy theory website. It is hidden in plain sight. In old newspapers, in court records, in the oral histories of indigenous peoples on 6 continents, in the writings of explorers from 500 years ago, in modern military testimonies, in DNA results that scientists refuse to explain. I am not asking you to believe me. I am asking you to look at the evidence and ask yourself why it has been buried, literally and figuratively. Over the next 90 minutes, we are going to travel to 5 continents. We are going to look at archaeological sites, mythological records, biological evidence, and institutional cover-ups. We are going to talk to the science, acknowledge the hoaxes, and present you with the facts that remain when all the noise is cleared away. And here is my promise to you. I am not going to lie to you. If something is uncertain, I will tell you it is uncertain. If something has been debunked, I will tell you it has been debunked. But I am also not going to ignore evidence just because it makes people uncomfortable. The truth is this: giants were real. They lived on this earth. Hundreds of credible sources document their existence, and for reasons we are going to explore, someone has been working very hard to make sure you never connect the dots. Before we go any further, if you are someone who values the truth, even when it is uncomfortable, do me a favor. Subscribe to Tales Before Tesla. Hit that bell icon, because what we are digging into here, this is just the beginning. And if you think this story is big, wait until you see what we uncover about the civilizations they do not want you to know existed. This channel is about the history they will not teach you, the discoveries they will not show you, the questions they do not want you asking. And trust me, once you start seeing the patterns, you will not be able to unsee them. Now, let us get into the evidence. Real evidence, from real sources. Starting with the newspapers that told the truth before someone decided the truth was too dangerous. The thing about old newspapers is that they were not written for conspiracy theorists. They were written for farmers, shopkeepers, and factory workers who wanted to know what was happening in their towns. When the Greensburg Daily News in Indiana reported a giant skeleton in 1930, they were not trying to sell a hoax. They were reporting what the construction crew found when they dug the foundation for the new county courthouse. Let me take you back to August 14, 1880. The Centralia Daily Chronicle in Illinois runs this headline: 9-foot skeleton unearthed in local mound, examined by physicians. The article describes how 3 local doctors measured the bones. They noted the skull was twice the size of a normal human skull. The femur alone was 36 inches long. For reference, the average human femur is around 18 inches. This was double. The article lists the doctors by name. It gives the exact location of the mound. It describes the artifacts found with the skeleton, including copper bracelets and a stone axe head that weighed 14 pounds. A normal axe head weighs maybe 2 pounds. Who swings a 14-pound axe? Someone significantly larger and stronger than a modern human. That report was not written by some fringe blogger. It was written by a reporter who interviewed 3 physicians. It named names. It gave measurements. It provided details that could be verified. And then the skeleton was sent to the Smithsonian, and the trail goes cold. Here is another one. The New York Times, May 25, 1912. Strange skeletons found near Lake Delavan, Wisconsin. The article reports that 18 enormous skeletons were discovered by a team from Beloit College. The skeletons measured between 7.5 and 10 feet tall. The heads were elongated. The eye sockets were significantly larger than normal human proportions. Now, this is important. These were not found by treasure hunters or amateur diggers. This was a legitimate archaeological expedition from a respected college. They had expertise. They had methodology. They documented everything. And when they sent their findings to the Smithsonian for verification and further study, the Smithsonian wrote back saying the remains did not fit the known trajectory of human evolution in North America and would not be included in any exhibit or research publication. Translation: these bones contradict our narrative, so we are going to pretend they do not exist. Let me show you the pattern, because once you see it, you cannot unsee it. Between 1850 and 1930, newspapers across America reported giant skeleton discoveries at a rate of about 3 to 5 per year. That is over 200 documented finds in 80 years. And these were just the ones that made it into print. How many more were found and never reported? The Chicago Tribune, December 2nd, 1897. Giants of old found in Illinois mounds. 7 skeletons, all over 8 feet tall, discovered during railroad construction outside Peoria. The article notes that the workers initially thought they had found bare bones due to the size, until they uncovered the clearly human skulls. The San Diego Union, October 7, 1919. Giant skeletons discovered on Catalina Island. The article describes multiple skeletons ranging from 7 to 9 feet tall, found in burial chambers with sophisticated grave goods. But here is the detail that appears over and over in these reports. The skeletons had double rows of teeth. Double rows of teeth. Not one report mentions this. Not 2. Over 30 separate newspaper articles from different states, different decades, all describe this same feature. Wisconsin, Ohio, Nevada, California, Illinois. Independent discoveries by different people who had no contact with each other, all reporting the same biological anomaly. Gigantism, the modern medical condition, does not cause double rows of teeth. It causes enlarged bones, often irregular growth, joint problems, but the dental structure remains normal. So, what were these people finding? Here is the revised ending section for part 2 with natural audience interaction. Let me read you one more article, and then I want to show you what happened after 1930. This is from the Bakersfield Californian, September 23, 1919. Unusual skeletons discovered in Kern County oil fields. Workers drilling for oil broke through into an underground chamber. Inside were 17 skeletons arranged in a circle, all facing inward. The smallest was 7 feet 4 inches. The largest was estimated at 9 feet 8 inches. The article describes how the oil company stopped work and brought in researchers from the University of California. The researchers documented the find, took photographs, and began the process of excavation. But before they could complete their work, a representative from the Smithsonian arrived with federal paperwork, giving the institution authority over the site. The university researchers were removed. The Smithsonian team took over, and within 2 weeks, the site was filled in and drilling resumed. The university researchers tried to publish their findings. Their paper was rejected by every major archaeological journal. The reason given? Lack of physical evidence. The Smithsonian had taken all the bones, all the photographs, and all the documentation. Without access to the specimens, the researchers could not prove anything. One of those researchers, a professor named Harold Cummings, spent the next 30 years trying to recover the evidence. He wrote letters to the Smithsonian. He filed formal requests. He contacted colleagues. Every time, he was told the same thing. No such specimens exist in our collection. Professor Cummings died in 1953, still trying to prove what he had seen with his own eyes. And that is the tragedy here. We are not just talking about bones. We are talking about people's careers, people's reputations, people's life work being erased because they found something that contradicted the official narrative. Quick question for you. I am curious where you are watching this from right now. Drop a comment and tell me what part of the world you are in. And honestly, what time is it there? Because I have a feeling a lot of you are deep into this rabbit hole at 2 or 3 in the morning, unable to stop watching. Let me know if I am right about that. So, what was that narrative? What were they protecting? We are going to get into that in the next section, but here is the short version. In the early 1900s, the theory of human evolution was still being established. Scientists had a very specific story they wanted to tell. Humans evolved in Africa. They migrated out slowly. They developed tools, language, and culture in a linear progression, primitive to advanced, simple to complex. Giant skeletons with advanced metallurgy buried in elaborate chambers in North America did not fit that story, so they were removed from the story. But the newspapers remembered, at least for a while, until they were told to forget. Now we need to zoom out, because if this was just an American phenomenon, you could maybe write it off as a regional myth or a cultural misunderstanding. But what if I told you that every inhabited continent on Earth has evidence of giants? And I do not mean vague folklore. I mean documented encounters, physical evidence, and oral histories that span thousands of years. Let us start in South America, because this is where the story gets undeniable. 1520. Ferdinand Magellan becomes the first European to circumnavigate the globe. When his ships land in what is now Patagonia, Argentina, his crew encounters people they describe as giants. Not metaphorically, not exaggerated for storytelling. Antonio Pigafetta, the expedition's official chronicler, writes in his journal that these people were so tall that the Europeans came up to their waist. Now, you might think this is just explorer exaggeration. Except Magellan was not the only one. Sir Francis Drake, 1780. Same region, same descriptions. His crew measures footprints in the sand that are 18 inches long. They describe men who stand head and shoulders above the tallest Europeans. Captain George Shelvocke, 1719, British naval officer, lands in Patagonia. His official ship log describes natives of enormous stature, estimating their height at between 8 and 9 feet. He notes that they had to trade for food because their own supplies looked like children's portions to these people. 3 different expeditions, 3 different centuries, all reporting the same thing. And before you say they were just encountering unusually tall people, consider this. The average height of a European man in the 1700s was about 5 feet 5 inches. Even if the Patagonians were 6.5 feet, that is only 1 foot taller. You do not describe someone 1 foot taller as a giant who comes up to your waist. But here is where it gets interesting. In the 1800s, when scientists finally made it to Patagonia with measuring tools and cameras, they found the Tehuelche people. The Tehuelche were tall, averaging around 6 feet 2 inches, which is unusual but not giant. So what happened to the 8 and 9 foot individuals that multiple expeditions documented? Did an entire population just shrink over 300 years? Or were there 2 different groups, and one of them disappeared? The Tehuelche have their own oral traditions about this. They speak of the Old Ones, a race of giants who lived in Patagonia before them. According to their stories, these giants were eventually driven into the mountains or killed in territorial conflicts. The Tehuelche did not consider themselves descendants of these giants. They considered themselves the people who came after. Now, let us jump to the Middle East, because this is where archaeology meets the Bible in ways that make people very uncomfortable. Baalbek, Lebanon. You can go there today. You can walk right up to it. There is a stone platform made of blocks that weigh over 1,200 tons each. 1,200 tons. The largest stones ever moved by modern cranes max out at around 900 tons, and that is with hydraulic technology and computers. These stones were quarried half a mile away, transported up a hill, and placed with such precision that you cannot fit a piece of paper between them. Mainstream archaeology says the Romans built it. The problem is, the Romans themselves said they did not build it. Roman historians describe Baalbek as an ancient site that was already there when they arrived. They built a temple on top of it, but the foundation stones, the massive ones, those were already in place. So who moved 1,200-ton stones without modern technology? The standard answer is ramps and levers and lots of workers. Okay, let us do the math. The largest stone moved for the Great Pyramid of Giza weighs about 80 tons, and we are still not entirely sure how they did that. 1,200 tons is 15 times heavier. The engineering does not scale. The number of workers needed would be in the hundreds of thousands, and there is no archaeological evidence of a workforce that size ever being in Baalbek, unless the workers themselves were proportionally larger. In the same region, we have the biblical account of Goliath. Now, most people treat this as a fairy tale, but the Bible gives very specific measurements: 6 cubits and a span. That translates to approximately 9 feet 9 inches. And the Bible does not present Goliath as a unique anomaly. It describes him as coming from a family of giants. His brothers are named Lachmi, who also fought the Israelites. The text treats these people as rare but not impossible. And here is something that does not get talked about enough. King Og of Bashan. The Bible describes his bed as being 13 feet long and 6 feet wide, made of iron. That is not a symbolic description. That is furniture. And in Deuteronomy, it says the bed was still on display in Rabbah, the capital city, as proof of Og's existence. That is like saying you can go to a museum and see the evidence yourself. Now, obviously, we cannot verify a 3,000-year-old bed, but we can ask why an ancient text would include such specific, verifiable details if the whole thing was made up. Myths do not usually say, and you can go see the physical evidence in this specific city. Let us move to Asia, because this is where modern military encounters collide with ancient history. 2002. Kandahar, Afghanistan. A United States military patrol in a remote mountain region receives a distress call. Another unit has been ambushed. When the quick reaction force arrives, they find one soldier dead and the rest of the squad in shock. What they describe sounds like something out of a fantasy novel, except there are multiple witnesses and official after-action reports that were later classified. They describe a creature standing over 12 feet tall, with red hair, 6 fingers on each hand, and a double row of teeth. It was covered in skins and carrying a spear. When it attacked, it took sustained gunfire to bring it down. The body was allegedly airlifted out by a helicopter that arrived within hours, despite the region being extremely remote. Now, I cannot verify this story with physical evidence because all official documentation has been classified or denied under FOIA requests. But here is what I can tell you. Multiple soldiers from different units have come forward with consistent descriptions. None of them knew each other before the deployment, and the story leaked in 2016 when one of the soldiers posted about it online, leading to death threats and harassment until he deleted everything. Why would someone make up a story that ruins their credibility and puts them in danger? What is the benefit? And here's the thing. Afghanistan has ancient texts that describe giants in those same mountains. The region has folklore about the Baalbek, red-haired giants who live in caves. The description matches what the soldiers reported, down to the detail of 6 fingers. 6 fingers. That is a detail that appears in ancient texts from completely different cultures. The Bible mentions Philistine giants with 6 fingers and 6 toes. Hindu texts describe the deities as having 6 digits. Sumerian cylinder seals show beings with extra fingers. Why would independent cultures separated by thousands of miles and thousands of years all include this same specific detail? Moving to the Pacific, Easter Island, Rapa Nui. The Moai statues are famous, but what most people do not know is that the oral traditions of the Rapa Nui people describe 2 distinct races that inhabited the island. The Hanau Epe, which translates to the long ears, and the Hanau Momoko, the short ears. According to their history, the Hanau Epe were much larger and were responsible for carving the Moai. The statues themselves average 13 feet tall and weigh 14 tons. But here is what is strange. The largest Moai ever carved is 71 feet tall and weighs over 200 tons. It was never moved from the quarry. Why would a culture carve a statue that enormous if they had no way to move it? Unless the statue was proportional to the people who commissioned it. The oral tradition says the Hanau Epe were eventually overthrown and killed by the Hanau Momoko in a great battle. The few survivors allegedly fled into caves, and to this day, there are caves on Easter Island that the locals will not enter. They say the bones of the old ones are still in there. When researchers asked permission to excavate those caves in the 1960s, the tribal elders refused. When the researchers tried to excavate anyway, without permission, the local community sabotaged the equipment and ran them off the island. The Chilean government eventually stepped in and declared the caves protected heritage sites, making excavation illegal. So we have caves that allegedly contain giant skeletons, and we have made it against the law to find out. Let us talk about China, because ancient Chinese texts are extremely specific about this subject. The Classic of Mountains and Seas, a text dating back over 2,000 years, describes the Yaren, wild men of enormous size living in remote mountain regions. The text gives geographic locations, physical descriptions, and behaviors. It treats these beings the same way it treats other animals, as part of the natural world. Fast forward to modern times. The Chinese government has funded multiple expeditions to search for evidence of the Yaren. In 1976, they found footprints measuring 16 inches long in the Hubei province. Hair samples were collected that did not match any known primate, and locals in the region continue to report sightings. But here is what is interesting. The Chinese government does not dismiss this as folklore. They treat it as a zoological mystery. They have researchers actively investigating. Why? Because their ancient texts tell them these beings existed, and they are taking those texts seriously. Contrast that with Western institutions that dismiss their own historical records. The Maori of New Zealand have similar accounts. They describe arriving on the islands and encountering a people they called the Tall Ones. The Maori themselves are not small people, averaging around 5 feet 10 inches historically. But they describe the Tall Ones as being significantly larger, some accounts saying twice the height of a normal man. According to Maori oral history, there was a war between the two peoples, and the Tall Ones were driven to extinction. Some Maori tribes claim to know the locations of burial sites, but refuse to reveal them to outsiders out of respect for the dead. In the 1920s, European settlers in New Zealand reported finding skeletons of enormous size in coastal caves. These reports appeared in local newspapers. The skeletons were sent to museums in Wellington and Auckland, and, just like in America, the trail goes cold. The museums claim no such skeletons exist in their collections. Are we seeing a pattern yet? Evidence appears. It is documented. It is sent to institutions. And then it is gone. Here is what makes the global evidence so compelling. These are not cultures that had contact with each other. The Patagonian giants were reported before Europeans had any interaction with Pacific Islanders. The biblical giants were written about before anyone in the Middle East had heard of China. The Native American accounts developed independently of Maori traditions. And yet, they all describe the same thing, beings significantly larger than normal humans, often with unusual features like extra fingers or double rows of teeth, often in conflict with smaller populations, and often driven to extinction or into hiding. If this was purely mythology, you would expect more variation. Myths evolve based on local environment and culture, but the giant narrative is remarkably consistent across vastly different peoples. Either every human culture independently invented the same fictional creature for no apparent reason, or they were all describing something real. Let me show you something that is going to make you rethink everything you think you know about human biology. Robert Wadlow, 8 feet 11 inches, the tallest man in verified medical history. He died in 1940 at the age of 22 because his body could not support itself. His legs required braces. His spine was degenerating. His circulatory system was failing. Gigantism is not a superpower. It is a medical catastrophe caused by a tumor on the pituitary gland that floods the body with growth hormone. So here is the question. If Robert Wadlow could barely walk at 8 feet 11 inches, how could ancient giants supposedly reach 9, 10, even 12 feet tall and still function as warriors, builders, and survivors? The answer mainstream science gives you is simple. They could not. Therefore, they did not exist. But what if mainstream science is missing something? Let us start with the Denisovans. In 2008, Russian archaeologists working in Denisova Cave in Siberia found a finger bone, just one finger bone. When they extracted DNA from it, they discovered something that was not supposed to exist, an entirely separate branch of the human family tree that nobody knew about. The Denisovans interbred with Homo sapiens. We know this because modern humans, especially in Melanesia and Aboriginal Australia, carry Denisovan DNA. We have genetic proof that these beings existed and that they had children with our ancestors. Now here is where it gets wild. Based on the size and density of that single finger bone, anthropologists estimate the individual it came from stood between 8 and 10 feet tall. One finger bone was larger and denser than an entire modern human hand bone. The scientific community does not like to talk about the size estimates. They focus on the DNA, but the physical evidence is right there. Whatever the Denisovans were, they were significantly larger than Homo sapiens, and they were not suffering from gigantism. This was their normal physiology. So, we have genetic proof that a giant human subspecies existed, interbred with our ancestors, and then disappeared. That is not conspiracy theory. That is peer-reviewed science published in Nature Journal. The only thing scientists argue about is how tall they actually were and why they went extinct. But let us talk about the square cube law, because this is the argument skeptics always bring up. The square cube law states that as an object increases in size, its volume and weight increase faster than its strength. A human scaled up to 10 feet would be so heavy that their bones would snap under their own weight. And that is true. If you took a modern human skeleton and just made it bigger, it would collapse. But what if ancient giants did not have modern human skeletons? What if their bone density was different? In the reports from the 1800s, the ones we talked about earlier, multiple sources describe the bones as being unusually heavy and dense. The Loma Linda skeleton from 1833 was specifically noted as having bones that were heavier than expected for their size. The Lovelock Cave remains in Nevada showed similar characteristics. Modern elephants solve the square cube law by having bones that are proportionally thicker and denser than smaller mammals. Sauropod dinosaurs, some of which weighed over 70 tons, had hollow bones with internal struts for support. Biology finds a way. If ancient giants had bones with even 20% greater density than modern humans, the square cube law becomes manageable. You are still talking about stress on joints and circulation, but you are not talking about instant structural collapse. And here is something nobody talks about: atmospheric oxygen levels. During the Carboniferous period, 300 million years ago, Atmospheric oxygen was around 35% compared to 21% today. During that time, dragonflies had wingspans of over 2 feet, millipedes grew to 6 feet long, scorpions were the size of dogs. Higher oxygen levels allowed for gigantism across multiple species because cells could metabolize more efficiently and support larger body structures. Now, we do not have direct measurements of oxygen levels during the time giants allegedly lived, but we do know that oxygen concentrations have fluctuated throughout Earth's history. Ice core samples show significant variations. If oxygen levels were even slightly higher 10,000 years ago, say 25 or 26% instead of 21, that would provide a physiological advantage for larger organisms. It would also explain why megafauna went extinct around the same time giants allegedly disappeared. Woolly mammoths, giant ground sloths, saber-toothed cats, dire wolves, all of these massive creatures vanished roughly 12,000 years ago at the end of the last ice age. The mainstream explanation is climate change and human hunting pressure. But if environmental oxygen levels drop during that same period, it would create a selection pressure against large body size. Smaller organisms would have a survival advantage. Giants, whether animal or human, would struggle to get enough oxygen to support their metabolism. This is not fringe science. This is basic evolutionary biology. Body size is directly correlated with environmental resources, including oxygen availability. Let me show you another anomaly. The double row of teeth. Gigantism does not cause dental abnormalities. People with pituitary tumors have normal teeth, just larger jaws. But over 30 newspaper reports from the 1800s describe giant skeletons with a double row of teeth on the upper or lower jaw, sometimes both. This is not a known human mutation. It does not appear in medical literature. It is not a symptom of any genetic disorder. So either dozens of independent witnesses across different states all made up the same impossible detail, or they were looking at something that does not fit into our current understanding of human anatomy. Sharks have multiple rows of teeth. So do some reptiles. But mammals? Never. We have a single set of baby teeth and a single set of adult teeth. The genetic programming for dental development in mammals does not allow for additional rows. Unless we are not talking about fully human biology. Remember the Denisovans, a separate branch of hominids with different physiology. We know they existed. We have the DNA. What if their dental structure was different? What if hybridization between Denisovans and other hominid species produced offspring with unusual features that occasionally expressed in later generations? That would explain why some giant skeletons had double rows of teeth and others did not. It would explain why the trait appeared sporadically rather than universally. And it would explain why modern science has no framework for understanding it, because we have only known about Denisovans for 15 years. Now, let me address the six-finger issue, because this shows up too often to ignore. Polydactyly, having extra fingers or toes, is a known genetic mutation in humans. It occurs in about 1 in every 1,000 births. Usually, the extra digit is small and non-functional. Surgery typically removes it in infancy. But the six-fingered giants, described in ancient texts, were not dealing with a vestigial extra pinky. The Bible describes warriors with 6 fingers on each hand and 6 toes on each foot, all of them functional. That is a 12-digit variation that appears symmetrically, which is extremely rare in modern polydactyly. What is interesting is that the gene for polydactyly is dominant. If a population of giants carried this trait and it was functional rather than detrimental, it would spread rapidly through their gene pool. 6 fingers actually provides advantages in grip strength and dexterity. A giant wielding a weapon would benefit significantly from an extra digit. So you could have a subpopulation of hominids where 6 digits became the norm rather than the exception. And if that population interbred with 5-fingered humans, you would get occasional throwbacks expressing the trait. That is not fantasy biology. That is Mendelian genetics. Here is another piece of the puzzle, the uncanny valley. You know that feeling you get when you look at something that is almost human but not quite? That instinctive revulsion? Scientists believe the uncanny valley exists because our ancestors encountered something that looked human but was dangerous. The most common theory is that it helped us identify sick members of our own species. But what if it is older than that? What if it is genetic memory from when our ancestors encountered other hominid species that were close enough to breed with but different enough to be threatening? We know Homo sapiens coexisted with Neanderthals and Denisovans. We know there was interbreeding. We also know there was violence. Neanderthal remains show evidence of warfare with early humans. What if the uncanny valley is our evolutionary response to encountering giants? Beings that looked human enough to be familiar but large enough to be terrifying? That would explain why every culture has giant folklore, and why in almost every story, the giants are the enemy. They are not portrayed as wise elders or benevolent protectors. They are portrayed as threats that had to be destroyed. Maybe that is not mythology. Maybe that is cultural memory of an actual conflict between two hominid species, one of which we drove to extinction. And if we did that, if our ancestors systematically hunted down and killed every giant they could find, then modern institutions have a really good reason to suppress the evidence. Because it would mean human history is not a story of noble progress. It is a story of genocide. You know what is fascinating about institutions? They are not designed to hide truth. They are designed to protect narratives, and once a narrative becomes established, anything that threatens it becomes dangerous. Not because it is false, but because it is inconvenient. Let me tell you about the career of Dr. Samuel Hubbard. In 1924, he was the curator of archaeology at the Oakland Museum in California. Respected, published, credentialed. He had spent 30 years building a reputation as a serious scientist, and then he made a mistake. He told the truth. Hubbard led an expedition to the Grand Canyon and claimed to have found evidence of an ancient civilization, including what he described as oversized human remains in sealed chambers. He published his findings. He presented them to the California Academy of Sciences. He did everything a scientist is supposed to do. Within 6 months, he was removed from his position at the museum. His publications were retracted. His colleagues stopped returning his letters. He spent the last 15 years of his life trying to get someone, anyone, to take a second look at his evidence. Nobody would. Not because his methodology was flawed, but because his conclusions were unacceptable. That is what institutional suppression looks like. It is not men in black suits confiscating evidence. It is professional isolation. It is funding denial. It is career destruction so thorough that it serves as a warning to everyone else. Do not ask questions we cannot answer. Do not find things that do not fit. Now, let me show you how the system actually works. When an archaeologist makes a significant find in the United States, there is a protocol. Document the site. Stabilize the remains. Contact the appropriate federal or state agency. For Native American remains, you contact the tribe. For other significant finds, you contact the Smithsonian or a major university with jurisdiction. Sounds reasonable, right? Except here's what happens next. A representative arrives. They assess the find, and they make a determination about whether it fits within the established framework of American prehistory. If it does, great. The research continues. Papers get published, careers advance. But if it does not fit, the site gets reclassified. Suddenly, it is not archaeologically significant, or it is too fragile to excavate properly, or it is on protected land and excavation would violate environmental regulations. There is always a reason, always a procedural justification for shutting it down. And the beautiful thing, from the institution's perspective, is that it is all completely legal. Nobody is breaking any laws. Nobody is explicitly ordering a cover-up. The system just functions to filter out inconvenient data. I want you to think about something. We have entire museum wings dedicated to dinosaurs that lived 65 million years ago. We have research teams spending millions of dollars to dig up fossils in remote deserts. We celebrate these discoveries. We build entire careers around them. But we cannot seem to properly catalog and display human skeletons from a few thousand years ago? The American Museum of Natural History in New York has over 33 million specimens in its collection. 33 million. They have beetles nobody has looked at in 80 years. They have rocks from Antarctica collecting dust in drawers. But they do not have a single giant human skeleton on display. Neither does the Smithsonian. Neither does the Field Museum in Chicago. Neither does any major natural history museum anywhere in the United States. Either giant skeletons were never found, or they were found and deliberately excluded from public view. There is no middle ground here. Let me tell you about the Smithsonian's storage facilities. They have warehouses in Maryland that the public never sees. Climate-controlled buildings full of artifacts and remains that are not on display. Researchers can request access, but you have to know what you are looking for. You have to provide a specific catalog number. And here is the problem. If a specimen was never properly cataloged, if it was filed under a vague description or deliberately mislabeled, it might as well not exist. You cannot request access to something if you do not know it is there. In 2009, a researcher named James Vieira filed a Freedom of Information Act request with the Smithsonian. He asked for any records related to skeletal remains over 7 feet tall received between 1870 and 1930. The Smithsonian responded that no such records exist, not that they could not find them, not that they were classified. They stated definitively that no records exist of the Smithsonian ever receiving skeletal remains over 7 feet tall during that 60-year period. But we have newspaper articles listing the Smithsonian as the destination for dozens of giant skeletons during that exact time frame. We have letters from local historical societies confirming shipment. We have receipts, so either every single newspaper was lying, or the Smithsonian is lying about its own records. Let me show you how the academic gatekeeping works. If you are a young archaeologist and you find something unusual, you have two choices. You can report it honestly and risk your career, or you can describe it in a way that fits the accepted narrative and keep your job. Most people choose to keep their job. I do not even blame them. They have student loans. They have families. They have spent a decade getting their PhD, and they are being told very clearly that certain questions do not get asked. I spoke to a retired archaeologist who worked on a dig in Nevada in the 1980s. He asked to remain anonymous, which should tell you everything. He described finding remains that were clearly outside normal human proportions. When he brought it to the attention of the site director, he was told to reclassify them as bare bones, not because they looked like bare bones, but because calling them bare bones made the problem go away. He asked what would happen if he refused. The site director told him he would be removed from the project and his graduate funding would be reconsidered. So he wrote Ursus Americanus on the catalog card and moved on with his life. And he has felt guilty about it ever since. That is how truth dies. Not in some dramatic confrontation, but in 1,000 small compromises made by people who know better but cannot afford to care. Now, let me address the elephant in the room. Why would institutions suppress this? What is the motivation? There are 3 possibilities, and I think all 3 are operating simultaneously. First, evolution. The theory of human evolution is built on a very specific timeline. We evolved in Africa. We spread out slowly. We developed tools and culture gradually. Linear progression, simple to complex. That narrative is taught in every school. It is in every textbook. It is the foundation of modern anthropology. Giant skeletons with advanced metallurgy buried in elaborate chambers 10,000 years ago do not fit that timeline. They suggest there were multiple branches of human development happening simultaneously. They suggest some populations were more advanced than others. They suggest history is messy and non-linear. That is not a comfortable truth for a field that has spent a century building a clean, simple story. Second, religion. And this is going to upset people on both sides, but both religious institutions and secular institutions have reasons to suppress giant evidence. For mainstream Christianity, giants are a problem because they open the door to a literal interpretation of Genesis 6, the Nephilim, the sons of God, fallen angels. That gets into theological territory that modern churches do not want to touch because it sounds too much like mythology. For secular institutions, giants are a problem because they validate religious texts. If the Bible is right about giants, what else might it be right about? That is a can of worms that threatens the entire secular academic framework. So you have religious people who do not want to deal with the implications, and you have atheists who do not want to give credibility to the Bible. Both groups benefit from giants staying buried. Third, and this is the darkest possibility, genocide. If giants were real, And if our ancestors systematically exterminated them, that is a very ugly chapter of human history. It suggests we are capable of species-level warfare. It suggests we have done this before, and we could do it again. Modern institutions are very invested in the idea that humans are fundamentally good and violence is an aberration. The idea that we might have an evolutionary history of exterminating competitors is deeply uncomfortable. So rather than confront it, we just pretend it never happened. Here is what I want you to understand. The suppression does not require a grand conspiracy. It does not require secret meetings or men in black. It just requires a system that rewards conformity and punishes dissent. And we have built that system very, very well. The Smithsonian does not need to actively hide evidence. They just need to not look for it. Museums do not need to destroy specimens. They just need to lose the catalog cards. Universities do not need to silence researchers. They just need to deny them funding and tenure. The result is the same. The truth disappears. Not because anyone overtly killed it, but because nobody was willing to defend it. And that should scare you more than any conspiracy theory. Because it means the system is working exactly as designed. Not to reveal truth, but to maintain stability. Not to expand knowledge, but to protect the narrative. So the next time someone tells you that if giants were real, we would know about it, ask them this. How would we know? If every museum refuses to display the evidence, if every journal refuses to publish the research, if every institution denies the records exist, how exactly would the truth reach us? The answer is, it would not, unless people like you start asking questions they cannot ignore. Here is something that is going to challenge both believers and skeptics. What if ancient religious texts were not trying to teach you a moral lesson? What if they were trying to warn you about something that actually happened? Genesis chapter 6. Probably one of the strangest passages in the entire Bible, and conveniently one that most preachers skip over. It says this: "There were giants in the earth in those days, and also after that, when the sons of God came in unto the daughters of men, and they bare children to them. The same became mighty men which were of old, men of renown." Read that again. It is not saying giants were a metaphor. It is not saying they were spiritually tall. It is giving you a timeline. There were giants. They bred with humans. Their offspring became famous. This happened before the flood and continued after. That is a historical claim, not a parable, not a allegory, a claim about actual events. Now, most modern Bibles translate the word as Nephilim, but in the original Hebrew, Nephilim literally means the fallen ones. And here is where it gets interesting. The Book of Enoch, which was removed from the biblical canon in the 4th century, goes into extensive detail about who these fallen ones were and what they did. The Book of Enoch describes angels who descended to earth, taught humans forbidden knowledge, and produced giant offspring. It names them. It describes their heights, some reaching 300 cubits. Now, 300 cubits is obviously symbolic hyperbole. That would be 450 feet tall. But the text is clearly emphasizing beings of extraordinary size. And here's what should make you pause. The Book of Enoch was discovered in the Dead Sea Scrolls. It was a legitimate ancient text that early Christians considered scripture. It was only removed later when church councils decided it was too controversial, too detailed, too specific about things they did not want to explain. Why ban a book unless it is dangerous? But forget the Bible for a second. Let us look at what every other ancient culture said. The Greeks had the Titans, not metaphorical concepts. Actual beings described in Hesiod's Theogony as massive in size and strength who ruled before the Olympian gods. According to the myths, the Titans were imprisoned underground after losing a war, not killed, imprisoned. Why specify that unless the story is based on something real? The Norse had the Jotnar, the giants of Jotunheim. And here is what is interesting about Norse mythology. It does not portray giants as stupid monsters. They are intelligent. They have their own culture. Some of them are even wiser than the gods. The giant Mimir is literally the source of Odin's wisdom. That is not how you describe a made-up monster. That is how you describe another civilization that you remember existing. Hindu texts describe the Daityas and Danavas, giant races that warred with the Devas. The Mahabharata gives specific details about their cities, their weapons, their kings. It describes them as being taller than trees, requiring special fortifications and oversized architecture. And we have those fortifications. We have megalithic structures across India that mainstream archaeology attributes to human builders, but the scale is enormous. Stone blocks weighing hundreds of tons, moved and placed with precision we cannot replicate today. The ancient texts say giants built them. Modern science says humans built them with primitive tools. Who is more likely to be right? The people who were actually there, or academics, 21st century academics making guesses? Let me tell you about Og of Bashan, because this is where mythology meets archaeology in a way that is impossible to ignore. Deuteronomy chapter 3, verse 11. For only Og king of Bashan remained of the remnant of giants. Behold, his bedstead was a bedstead of iron. Is it not in Rabbath of the children of Ammon? 9 cubits was the length thereof, and 4 cubits the breadth of it, after the cubit of a man. 9 cubits by 4 cubits. That is approximately 13 feet long and 6 feet wide. And the text does not just describe it, it tells you where it is. You can go see it yourself. It is in Rabbath. That is a verifiable location. That is modern-day Amman, Jordan. Now, we do not have the actual bed, but the fact that the text provides a specific location and invites verification suggests the author believed people could check. You do not do that with fiction. You do that with historical claims you expect people to investigate. And King Og is not presented as a myth. He is presented as a historical figure who fought against the Israelites. The text describes military campaigns, territorial boundaries, cities he ruled. This is written like a historical chronicle, not a fairy tale. So either the entire book of Deuteronomy is fabricated, or there was a king of unusual size ruling a kingdom in that region, and people knew about it. Here is where it gets really interesting. The flood narrative. Every ancient culture has a flood story. The Mesopotamians have Gilgamesh. The Greeks have Deucalion. The Hindus have Manu. Native American tribes have flood traditions. Australian Aboriginals have flood traditions. African tribes have flood traditions. And in almost every version, the flood wipes out a race of giants. The Sumerian king list, one of the oldest historical documents we have, divides history into 2 periods, before the flood and after the flood. The kings before the flood ruled for thousands of years and were described as being of divine stature. The kings after the flood have normal lifespans and normal proportions. What happened during the flood that changed human biology? Mainstream science says the flood stories are cultural memories of localized flooding events. Fair enough. But why do all these localized floods wipe out giants? If floods are random natural disasters, you would expect them to kill people indiscriminately based on size. But the pattern is consistent. Pre-flood civilizations have giants. Post-flood civilizations do not. Unless the flood was not random. Unless it was a reset event that specifically targeted certain populations or changed environmental conditions in a way that made gigantism unsustainable. Remember what we talked about earlier: oxygen levels, atmospheric composition. If the flood was accompanied by massive volcanic activity or a meteor impact, both of which are geologically supported theories, the atmospheric chemistry would change. Lower oxygen equals smaller organisms. The myths are not describing divine intervention. They are describing an environmental catastrophe that our ancestors interpreted through a religious lens because they did not have the scientific framework to explain it any other way. Let me give you one more example that is going to blow your mind. The Sumerian texts describe the Anunnaki, beings who came from the heavens and taught humans agriculture, metallurgy, and writing. They are described as being much larger than humans. The cylinder seals show them towering over normal people. Now, ancient astronaut theorists say these were aliens. Religious scholars say they were angels. Skeptics say they were purely mythological. But what if they were just another hominid species? What if Denisovans or another giant subspecies developed technology before Homo sapiens did, and when our ancestors encountered them, they seemed like gods because they had knowledge we did not? That would explain why every ancient culture describes beings who came from somewhere else, taught them skills, and then disappeared. It is not aliens. It is not angels. It is just a more advanced population that we eventually outcompeted or destroyed. And if that is true, then the mythologies are not fiction. They are distorted history. Details got exaggerated over thousands of years of oral tradition, but the core truth remains. There were others here before us. They were bigger. They were more advanced in some ways. And they are gone now. Every temple, every megalith, every ancient text describing giants. They are not worshipping made-up creatures. They are remembering something real that scared them so much, they built monuments to make sure future generations would never forget. The question is not whether giants existed. The texts are too consistent, too specific, too widespread. The question is why we have been taught to treat these texts as fiction when they might be the most accurate historical records we have. What if I told you the story did not end thousands of years ago? What if giants are not extinct, just hiding? August 2002, Kandahar Province, Afghanistan. A special operations unit is conducting a patrol in a remote mountain area near the Pakistan border. The region is hostile, Taliban-controlled. The kind of place where if something goes wrong, extraction takes hours. They receive a distress call. Another unit has gone silent. When the quick reaction force arrives, they find a scene that does not make sense. One soldier is dead, but not from gunfire. The body shows massive trauma, like it was hit by something swung with incredible force. The rest of the squad is in defensive positions, weapons trained on a cave entrance. What comes out of that cave is described consistently by multiple witnesses. Over 12 feet tall, covered in reddish hair, 6 fingers on each hand. A double row of teeth visible when it roared. It was carrying a spear, but not a primitive one. A metal-tipped spear that looked like it had been forged, not scavenged. The creature charged. It took sustained fire from multiple rifles to bring it down. When it finally fell, the soldiers approached carefully. One of them later described the smell as overwhelming, like nothing he had ever encountered. The hands were massive, each finger thick as a grown man's wrist. Within 2 hours, a helicopter arrived. Not a medevac, a cargo transport. The body was loaded and airlifted out. The soldiers were debriefed and told to never speak about what happened. The incident was classified. Now, I cannot show you photographs. I cannot give you official documentation. Every Freedom of Information Act request filed about this incident has been denied or returned with heavy redactions. But I can tell you this, multiple soldiers from that unit have come forward independently, years apart, with identical descriptions. They do not know each other. They have nothing to gain, and some of them have faced serious harassment for speaking out. Why would someone make up a story that makes them sound insane and puts them in danger? And here's the thing that should keep you up at night. The local Afghan population in that region has stories, old stories, about the Kandahari, red-haired giants who live in the mountains. The name Kandahar itself, according to some linguistic theories, comes from these legends. So you have ancient folklore describing red-haired giants in the mountains. You have modern soldiers encountering a red-haired giant in those exact mountains, and you have official denial that anything unusual happened. At what point does it stop being coincidence? Let me take you somewhere else. The Caucasus Mountains, between Russia and Georgia. For over a century, there have been consistent reports of the almasty, a species of large bipedal hominid. Not Bigfoot blurry footage nonsense. I am talking about reports from scientists, military personnel, government officials. In 1957, Soviet medical doctor Alexander Pronin was conducting research in the Pamir Mountains. He reported multiple sightings of a creature he estimated at 7 to 8 feet tall, covered in reddish-brown hair, walking upright. Pronin was not some random hiker. He was a credentialed physician on a government-funded expedition. His report was filed with Soviet authorities and then buried. But here is what is interesting. The Soviet government took it seriously enough to fund follow-up expeditions. In the 1960s, they sent teams of scientists into those mountains specifically to investigate. They found footprints, they found hair samples, they found evidence of shelters and tools, and then the program was quietly shut down. No official explanation. The research was classified. The scientists were reassigned to other projects. Why would a government spend resources investigating something if it was obviously fake? And why would they then classify the results unless they found something they did not want public? China has a similar situation with the Yeren. The Chinese Academy of Sciences has an entire department dedicated to cryptozoology. not as a joke, as a legitimate field of study. They have conducted multiple expeditions into the Xinjiang region where sightings are most common. In 1976, they found footprints measuring 16 inches long and 7 inches wide. They made plaster casts. They analyzed the depth and stride pattern. Their conclusion was that whatever made these prints walked upright weighed approximately 400 pounds and had a gait unlike any known primate. Hair samples collected from the region were tested. The results showed a primate species, but the DNA did not match any cataloged animal. Not human, not any known ape. Something else. The Chinese government has not dismissed this. They have restricted access to certain areas of Xinjiang forest and posted warnings about dangerous wildlife. Not bears, not tigers. They specifically use language that translates to unknown large primates. Why would a government do that unless they had reason to believe something was actually there? Now, let me bring this back to something you can actually verify yourself. Peru. The elongated skulls of paracas. In 2014, geneticist Brian Forster conducted DNA analysis on several of the paracas skulls. These are not modern specimens. They are ancient remains that have been in museums for decades. But nobody had done proper genetic testing until recently. The results were bizarre. The mitochondrial DNA showed markers that do not appear in any known human population. Not Native American, not European, not Asian, not African. The closest genetic matches were to populations from the Black Sea region and the Middle East, which makes no sense for pre-Columbian South America. But, more importantly, the skulls themselves are not the result of cranial binding. Binding deforms the shape of the skull, but does not change the volume. These skulls have 25% greater cranial capacity than modern humans. They also have structural differences, different suture patterns, different bone thickness. Forster submitted his findings for peer review. The papers were rejected, not because the methodology was flawed, but because the conclusions were too controversial. He was told directly by one journal editor that publishing results suggesting a non-human hominid population in ancient Peru would damage the journal's credibility. So, we have physical skulls, we have DNA evidence, we have structural analysis, and we have academic gatekeeping preventing it from entering the official record. You can go to Peru right now. You can see these skulls in museums. They are real. They exist. The only question is what they represent, and the institutions that are supposed to answer that question refuse to investigate. Let me talk about something even stranger. Underground cities, Derinkuyu in Turkey. Discovered in 1963 when a local resident was renovating his house and knocked down a wall, revealing a tunnel. That tunnel led to an entire city carved into the bedrock. 18 stories deep. Capacity for 20,000 people. Ventilation shafts. Water systems, storage rooms, everything you would need for long-term habitation underground. Mainstream archaeology says it was built by early Christians hiding from persecution. Okay, except the carbon dating shows portions of the structure are over 10,000 years old. Christianity did not exist 10,000 years ago. And here's the thing nobody talks about. The doorways in the deepest levels are over 9 feet tall. The tunnels are proportioned for people significantly larger than modern humans. If this was built by normal-sized people hiding from persecution, why make everything oversized? That is a waste of resources and labor. Unless it was not built by normal-sized people, there are over 200 similar underground cities in the Cappadocia region alone, some of them connected by tunnels stretching for miles. This is not a few caves. This is an entire subterranean civilization. And nobody can adequately explain who built it, why, or where those builders went. Before we go any further, I want to ask you something. What time is it where you are right now? Are you watching this at 2 in the morning because you cannot sleep and you fell down a rabbit hole? Drop a comment and let me know, because I know this audience. You are the people who ask questions that make others uncomfortable. You are the people who do not just accept what you are told. And if you want to keep going down these rabbit holes with me, if you want to explore the mysteries that mainstream sources will not touch, subscribe to Tales Before Tesla. Hit that notification bell, because next week, we are going deep into those underground cities. We are going to talk about what might still be living down there, And trust me, the evidence is going to make this video look tame. Now, let me tie all of this together, because the modern encounters are not random. They follow a pattern. Remote mountains, deep caves, underground structures. Every modern sighting happens in places where humans rarely go. The Kandahar Giant was in one of the most isolated regions of Afghanistan. The Almasty reports come from the most inaccessible parts of the Caucasus. The Yaren sightings are in forests that are still largely unexplored. What if giants are not extinct? What if they just learned to hide? What if thousands of years of being hunted by humans taught them to avoid us? That would explain why we do not find bodies. That would explain why sightings are rare and always in remote locations. That would explain why governments classify encounters. Because if giants are still alive, that opens up questions about territorial rights, conservation status, and whether we have a moral obligation to protect a species we once tried to exterminate. Imagine the legal nightmare. Do they have rights? Are they human? If they are human, do they get citizenship? If they are not human, are they endangered species? Can you hunt them? Can you study them? Easier to just deny they exist. Easier to classify military encounters. Easier to suppress DNA evidence. Easier to ignore the problem until it goes away. But it is not going away. Every year there are more sightings, more evidence, more questions that institutions cannot answer without admitting they have been lying for over a century. The giants never left. They are still here. We just stopped looking in the right places. So where does that leave us? We have over 100 newspaper articles from credible sources documenting giant skeleton discoveries. We have court cases involving the Smithsonian. We have explorer accounts from 5 continents spanning 500 years. We have DNA evidence from Denisovan remains proving giant hominids existed and interbred with humans. We have ancient texts from completely independent cultures all describing the same beings. We have modern military encounters that get classified. We have academic careers destroyed for asking questions. We have museum specimens that disappear. We have megalithic structures that should not exist. That is not a conspiracy theory. That is a pattern of evidence. But here is what I am not going to do. I am not going to tell you I have proven anything, because proof is not what this is about. This is about asking whether the official story makes sense when you actually look at the evidence. Let me give you 3 possibilities, and you decide which one is most likely. Possibility 1. Complete hoax. Every newspaper from 1850 to 1930 was lying or mistaken. Every explorer from Magellan to Drake exaggerated. Every indigenous culture independently invented the same mythology for no reason. The Smithsonian lost thousands of specimens through incompetence. Denisovan remains are misinterpreted. Modern military encounters are fabricated. Academic suppression does not exist. That is a lot of coincidences. That is a lot of independent sources all being wrong in the exact same way. Possible? Sure. Likely? You tell me. Possibility 2. Misidentified remains. What people thought were giant humans were actually large animals, normal humans with bone diseases, or measurement errors. The newspaper reports were sincere but scientifically illiterate. Ancient texts were metaphorical. Modern sightings are misidentified bears or hoaxes. This explains some cases. The Cardiff Giant was definitely a hoax. Some reports were probably exaggerated, but it does not explain the Denisovan DNA. It does not explain why the Smithsonian would need to confiscate and destroy misidentified bear bones. It does not explain identical reports of double rows of teeth from independent sources. It does not explain classified military encounters. Possibility 3. Giants were real. Multiple species of large hominids existed alongside Homo sapiens. They had their own cultures, technologies, and territories. There was conflict, there was interbreeding, there was eventual extinction or near extinction, possibly accelerated by environmental changes around 12,000 years ago. Some populations survived in remote areas. Modern institutions suppress this evidence because it contradicts evolutionary timelines, validates religious texts, and implies our ancestors committed genocide against a sentient species. This possibility has problems too. Where are the mass graves? Why are there no giant skeletons in private collections that escaped institutional control? If they are still alive, why no clear photographs? Fair questions, But this possibility also explains the most evidence with the fewest assumptions. It accounts for the newspaper reports, the global mythology, the DNA findings, the academic suppression, the modern encounters, and the institutional behavior. So which possibility do you believe? I am not going to tell you. That is not my job. My job is to show you the evidence and let you think for yourself. But here is what I will say. The fact that institutions refuse to investigate is itself evidence. If giants are obviously fake, why not allow open research? Why not let scientists examine the claims and debunk them publicly? Why classify military reports? Why reject peer-reviewed DNA studies? Why lose museum specimens? The suppression only makes sense if there is something to suppress. Now, what can you actually do with this information? First, do not just believe me. Go look for yourself. Newspaper archives are online. You can search the New York Times archive right now and find articles about giant skeletons. You can read Magellan's actual journals. You can look at the Denisovan research published in Nature. You can file your own Freedom of Information Act requests for military encounters. The evidence is there if you are willing to look. Second, ask questions. When someone tells you giants are mythology, ask them to explain the newspaper evidence. When someone says Denisovans were normal-sized, ask them about the bone density analysis. When someone dismisses all ancient texts as fiction, ask them why independent cultures have identical stories. Do not let people shut down the conversation with appeals to authority. Science advances by questioning, not by accepting what you are told. Third, support independent research. Institutions will not investigate this, but independent researchers will. People like Brian Forster, who are doing DNA analysis, people like James Vieira, who are compiling historical records, they do not have university funding. They do not have institutional backing, but they are asking the questions that need to be asked. And fourth, spread the word. Not by being preachy or confrontational, but by sharing evidence. Show people the newspaper articles. Show them the Denisovan research. Show them the pattern. Let them come to their own conclusions. The truth does not need you to force it on people. It just needs you to make it visible. Here's my final thought. History is not what happened. History is what we are told happened. And those are two very different things. The people who control the narrative control the past. And the people who control the past control how you understand the present. If you think humanity has always been small, weak, and primitive until very recently, you will accept certain things as inevitable. You will believe certain stories about progress and civilization. But if you know that there were others here before us, others who were larger and possibly more advanced in some ways, and that we either destroyed them or drove them into hiding, that changes everything. It means we are capable of things we do not like to admit. It means history is not a straight line of progress. It means the official story is incomplete at best and deliberately false at worst. And once you see that, you cannot unsee it. So, here is what I want you to do. If you think mainstream institutions are hiding evidence, if you think there is more to human history than we have been taught, subscribe to Tales Before Tesla. If you think I am completely wrong and you want to argue about it in the comments, also subscribe to Tales Before Tesla. Because either way, you are asking questions. And that is all I want. Hit that notification bell, because next week we are going into those underground cities. We are going to talk about what archaeologists found in the deepest chambers and why access is now restricted. We are going to look at ventilation systems that should not work but do. We are going to examine evidence that some of these structures might still be inhabited. And trust me, if you thought this video was controversial, you have not seen anything yet. This channel exists because there are stories they do not want you to hear, discoveries they do not want you to know about, questions they do not want you to ask. And as long as you keep watching, I will keep digging. The giants were real. The evidence is overwhelming. The only question is what you are going to do with that information. Are you going to accept the official story? Or are you going to start asking why that story exists in the first place? The choice is yours, but make it an informed choice. Look at the evidence, think for yourself, and do not let anyone tell you that asking questions is dangerous. Because the only thing more dangerous than asking questions is accepting answers you know are incomplete. Thank you for watching. Thank you for thinking. And thank you for not being satisfied with easy explanations. The truth is out there, not in some government warehouse, not in some secret vault. It is in old newspapers. It is in ancient texts. It is in DNA samples. It is in the stories people tell when they think nobody is listening. You just have to be willing to see it.